Why would a black man who's made it out of the hood start leaning conservative? And it might not just be humble beginnings that are driving that shift. Here's an interesting stat I found while researching for this video. According to Pew Research, 7% of black voters over 50 currently identify as or lean Republican, while 17% of black voters under 50 align with the Republican Party. Keep this in mind because I have a few explanations for it that you might find yourself in. But back to the main question, why would a black man who's made it out of the hood start leaning conservative? And why are younger black people turning the tide on a generational love affair with the Democratic Progressive Political Party? I got more curious about this question after the 2016 election, which saw Donald Trump become president. So I ran a poll on Twitter. I wanted to know how much my audience, which was smaller back then but still a low five-figure number of people, thought I had voted for Trump. I went looking for the tweet, but it got lost when I accidentally deleted all of my tweets, so I don't remember the exact percentage, but I know the majority of my followers thought I voted for him. However, something else I remember about this was a comment made by another black dude. He said, I don't think you voted for Trump, but I think most black men who made something of themselves, who came from nothing, tend to be conservative. Now, this was almost 10 years ago, but that line always stuck with me because there's a lot of truth in that statement for the black conservative community as a whole, and I'll dive into that a little later. But he was right. I didn't vote for Trump, or anyone for that matter, and I do overall lean conservative on some, but not all issues. Now, don't get it twisted. From a pure policy perspective, my political stance can be summed up as a combination of right wing, left wing, same bird, and culture tells politicians what to do, and politicians want to get reelected. To quote the conservative news editor Andrew Breitbart, politics is downstream from culture. In other words, I don't really think it matters who you vote for because all the politicians are in bed with one another and they want to get reelected, so the direction of the political system is largely dictated by what the people want. You get enough people who want something, and the politicians start to vote along these lines to keep their jobs. This really shouldn't be a surprise for anyone, as this is, for better or worse, the definition of democracy anyway. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily effective. At best, I think the system is fundamentally broken and flawed. At worst, I think it's perhaps highly inefficient, and those inefficiencies are deliberate. I used to think the global elite idea was just something that the conspiracy bros talked about, but now I'm not so sure. I say all that to say that I don't really lean towards any political parameters. I just try to worry about what I can control: my health, my family, my friends, where I live, and how I treat other people. And when it comes to those things, I definitely lean a little conservatively, culturally speaking. Because I found my friend's comments so interesting, I've done a lot of research, talked to a lot of people, and reflected on my own experiences and perspectives to understand not only why there is a small contingent of black people, particularly young black people, who lean conservative, but why that number is growing. This video goes into what I learned and what my experiences have been personally that have shaped me. Speaking of my experiences, before we get into it, I want to remind you we're about 6 weeks out from the release of my memoir, Hard Lessons from the Hurt Business, Boxing, and the Art of Life, where I teach you the hard-won lessons and insights gained from growing up in the projects, getting into boxing, becoming a stone-cold alcoholic, serving in the military, and ultimately getting sober, getting my degree in physics, and getting my life together. If you want a story that teaches everything from street smarts to stoicism to learning theory and forgiveness, make sure you pre-order your copy of Hard Lessons from the Hurt Business at the link in the pinned comment before August 5th when the book comes out. That way, you can get a slew of bonuses, including a live group chat and Q&A with me, along with another book and a Hard Lessons training guide. But that's only if you pre-order from the link in the pinned comment below and send me your receipt at ed@edlattimore.com. I'll have the email in that pinned comment. Now, let's get back into the black conservatives. We got to start out by defining exactly what makes someone politically conservative or liberal, because sometimes these are just thrown around as a knee-jerk reaction to something a person disagrees with, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page. My definition might not be 100% precise, and I'm sure there will be people who disagree on the particulars, but it's directionally accurate enough to be useful for this discussion. We got to get through this part first before we can make any sense of what many people of all races see as odd and potentially traitorous behavior of Black people voting Republican or having conservative values. A conservative is someone who generally believes that the best way to build and preserve a good society is through personal responsibility, respect for tradition, limited government, free markets, strong families, and moral order. Conservatives tend to value stability, law and order, and the idea that people rise or fall based largely on their own choices and effort. They believe that too much government interference often creates more problems than it solves, and that social change should happen slowly and carefully, if at all. A liberal, on the other hand, is someone who believes that the best way to build and preserve a good society is through equality, inclusion, compassion, and government action to correct injustice. Liberals tend to emphasize individual rights, societal safety nets, and protections for marginalized groups. They see government as a tool to reduce inequality, provide opportunity, and to create a fair playing field. Liberals are usually more comfortable with a rapid social change and are more likely to challenge traditional hierarchies and norms when they see them as unfair. Now, beyond these basic definitions, there's something deeper at play, and this is where the work of social psychologist Jonathan Haidt is really useful. Haidt's research, especially in his book The Righteous Mind, shows that conservatives and liberals aren't just disagreeing over policies and politicians. They actually approach morality and society from a different psychological foundation. According to Haidt, conservatives tend to draw from a broader set of moral values. They care about fairness and harm, just like liberals do, but they also place a strong emphasis on loyalty to their group, respect for authority, and preserving what they see as sacred or true. These additional moral foundations help to explain why conservatives often prioritize things like patriotism, religious values, and traditional structures. From a personality standpoint, conservatives score much higher on traits like conscientiousness, meaning they value order, duty, and structure. They're also generally lower in openness to new experiences, which means that they're way more cautious about new ideas and protective of the old ones. Liberals, on the other hand, tend to build their worldview mainly around the moral foundations of care and fairness, especially fairness and equality. They're more focused on protecting the vulnerable and creating a level playing field. Liberals usually score way higher on openness to new experience, so they're more drawn to novelty, diversity, and change. They're also more comfortable questioning authority or breaking from tradition if they believe it leads to greater justice and further inclusion. Now, neither side is inherently right or wrong. They're just different moral concerns and psychological tendencies. And like anything in life, it is possible to go too far in either direction. When that happens, what starts as a reasonable worldview turns into something extreme and dangerous. When someone leans too far to the right, it can look like a complete rejection of any role for government beyond protecting property and enforcing the law, to the point where even basic public goods like schools, infrastructure, or health protections are seen as tyranny. It becomes this kind of a blind worship of tradition that refuses to adapt new realities, even when those traditions are harmful or outdated. It creates a mindset that sees outsiders, whether immigrants, people of different races, or different lifestyles, as threats rather than neighbors or fellow citizens. And in its ugliest form, extreme right-wing ideology can morph into authoritarianism, racially based nationalism, or violent reactionary movements that want to impose rigid order by force. Now, on the flip side, when someone leans too far to the left, or what we call extreme liberalism, it can look like a belief that government should control or regulate almost every part of life, with no trust left in individual responsibility or private institutions. It can push for equality so absolute that it tries to force equal outcomes, no matter how fair or unworkable that is in practice. Side note, I once had an argument with someone and they told me there was no such thing as extreme leftism. I replied, the mere fact that you think that means you're likely an extreme leftist, because extreme people don't think anything else is extreme, or rather they think everything else is extreme except their position or point of view, even with the people who are a little closer to their own points of view. But I'll continue. Extreme leftist mindsets can create this mindset that sees all traditions, hierarchies, or differences as a form of oppression that must be torn down immediately without considering the consequences. The old Chesterton fence here. And if you don't know, that's the idea that you don't want to tear down a fence before you know why it was built. You might be keeping something out. And typically when we rush into progress, we are tearing down something that may actually, or rather, I'll rephrase that. When we rush into progress, and trying to undo what was done. We don't really know why a certain thing was done, so we may be doing more harm than good. Obviously, I'm not talking about when we decide to repeal something like slavery or giving women the right to vote. Those are progressive changes that I think everyone can agree is we're trying to all be treated as equal are good. But some things we need to consider that are progressive are not necessarily positive. Now, in its worst form, this extreme left-wing ideology, man, it can spiral into totalitarian control, suppression of speech, and violent revolutionary movements, just like extreme right-wing. And the problem, or rather the main highlight of the extreme left in this case, these are these ideas of for the greater good. My point is, both ends of the spectrum, when taken to the extreme, stop being about building a better society and start being more about control, division, and destruction. Opposites become indistinguishable at their extremes, and nowhere is this more observable than an extreme left or right wing takes. Now that we've got a good sense of what the left and right are and their motivations, it makes sense that for most of American history, Black Americans have identified as liberal or progressive, if for no other reason than that the Black experience in this country has improved largely because of progressive liberal attitudes pushing for change and rejecting the old traditional status quo. So if liberals and conservatives literally see the world through a different moral lens, it makes sense, though, that their personal experiences, especially hard ones, can push anyone towards any direction, which leads us back to this idea. Why are there some Black people, younger ones, shifting to a more conservative view? Why are Black people who are from a rough, humble beginning becoming more conservative as they, become not so rough and humble and improve in life? Now, it's important to note that there is a group of Black people who vote Democrat but consider themselves conservative. The last study I looked at about this, it had Black Americans at roughly 90% being Democrat. But within that, there's a sizable minority, 8 to 16%, who identifies conservative in their ideology. So with that out the way, let's think, what happens when a Black man makes it out of poverty? And why does that journey shape his views in a more conservative direction? When you grow up in a place where there's barely any real policing, where you see crime go unchecked because the cops either don't care or people are too scared to call them, you start to understand the value of law and order. I'm not talking about the kind of policing that harasses folks for no reason or guns down unarmed civilians. I'm talking about the actually serving and protecting that should go on. In the projects, when there weren't enough cops around or they turned a blind eye, that's when the predators came out. People got robbed, kids got jumped, families lived in fear. So when you finally get out of that environment, you develop a respect for structure and safety. You want communities to have the kind of order that lets people live, work, and raise families without constant danger. That's part of why men like me who make it out tend to lean more conservative on issues of crime and policing. We've seen what happens when there's no order. I've said this on another video, but I think defunding police is a dumb idea. But I also think the police need to be held accountable. I know there's a lot of debate about this next point, so I expect some pushback. But when I look at the stats on police shootings, I don't see a racial profiling issue. I see one that needs a major overhaul because a lot of unarmed suspects of all races are being shot and killed by the police. But at the end of the day, based on all of my experiences with the police, and I've got more than I'm proud of, my thought is that most cops aren't bad or racist, and we need more of them, not less, because I survived a neighborhood where there weren't a lot of them. And it wasn't just crime that shaped my views. Growing up, I saw close up what happens when you get stuck on the public assistance train, be it Section 8, public housing projects, or food stamps. I saw how it helped people to survive, but I also saw the trap it created. Nobody ever told me that being on welfare directly makes you lazy. It's not like that. But the way the system is set up, where the more you make, the more they take away your benefits, it creates this invisible wall. You start making a little progress, maybe you pick up extra work, and then suddenly you lose the assistance that was helping you keep the lights on. So people stay stuck, not because they want to, but because climbing out means risking everything. It's a vicious cycle. Now, not everyone on assistance is lazy or unmotivated, but the system often punishes progress. When you see that play out over and over again, you start to understand why some people say that too much government help can hold folks back as much as it helps them. That idea, that safety net that can turn into traps, that's another reason why men who make it out of poverty start leaning more conservative. Now, before I get to the next point, I got to make something clear. I've got nothing but respect out there for the true single moms out there with no assistance from the kid's father, but are still making it work. If you're holding it down, making sacrifices, and doing the best you can, I can't hate on you. I don't think it's a good idea to do it, but sometimes shit happens. Single moms do the best they can given the cards they've been dealt, or in some cases picked. It's obviously a rough situation, but when I'm critical of the mom and the dad. Their irresponsibility sets the kid up for failure. We have the stats to show how growing up with only one parent is a bigger disadvantage than growing up poor. But somehow, 85% of Democrats believe this is an acceptable arrangement compared to 70% of Republicans. Now, both of those numbers are high, but one is noticeably higher. Now, I'm not about to shame people for their lives, but I'm also not going to endorse it or find it acceptable. On this fact in particular, it's because I've seen how destructive it is. The boys especially grow up without discipline, without examples of how to be men. The household gets stretched thin emotionally and financially, and you see patterns repeat. Another generation of struggle, of boys getting lost to the streets or jail because they didn't have that structure of home. When you live through that, no surprise that you start valuing traditional family structures. It's not about judging anybody, it's about wanting what works. And from what I saw, strong families with two parents in the home worked a whole lot better. Republicans, and by extension conservatives, favor a traditional family structure more than Democrats. While doing research for this episode, though, I found something quite surprising. And I don't know where I'll go with this, but hear me out for a minute. When a survey was taken about the acceptance of different family arrangements, Black people had the strongest disagreement about a single parent raising a child. And it was not even close. The next closest group, I believe, were Asians at 71%. 66% of Black people didn't see that as acceptable. It's a fun random fact. I don't know what that means yet. I'll dig into it. But when you see all of this stuff, your attitude changes in some obvious ways. But another thing that happens, you start to see racism a little differently. I see a lot of Black conservatives stand and turn their principles into attacks against their own people. And I'm not about that. If for no other reason than I've met a lot of poor white people too, and I know that being poor isn't a race-specific issue. With that said, one thing that irks a lot of Black conservatives, myself included, is how white liberals assume that we need extra help in life. I'm not going to dive into political agendas, as that's way above my interest and pay grade. But the whole government, or rather the whole argument for not requiring an ID to vote is ridiculous. Every brother I've ever met knows how to get an ID. When Black people are used as a reason to abolish those laws, that's mid-key racist. And before I hit this next point, I know that DEI is for more than race. But there are Black people who feel like any race-based quota or favoritism is basically saying you aren't good enough on merit alone to get this job. There was a time in the US where affirmative action was needed to combat systemic racism, but many Black conservatives feel that this time has passed. I bring this point up to say that many Black conservatives, they see progressive and liberal ideas about Black people as an insult to what we're capable of. Even if a Black person doesn't identify with being conservative, many of us can't identify with not being considered equal in terms of our ability, which is one way to take many of these heavy-handed government initiatives. That's one way to interpret them, I should say. So that leaves many Black people in one of two camps. Either they don't align with or believe in government-assisted integration and just kind of mosey along on their way, or they actively oppose it. Either way, it makes them a target for labels like Coon or Uncle Tom, so they're forced into the only camp that doesn't actively despise them, the conservatives. Leaning conservative in these areas, though, doesn't mean you stop caring about people or that you deny the reality of racism, inequality, or injustice. It just means your experience teaches you that personal responsibility, discipline, structure, and hard work aren't just talking points, they're survival skills. That what lifted you out and they're what you want to see more of in the world, regardless of race or ethnicity. Now, my experience growing up in crime-filled, drug-filled public housing projects and making it out has given me this perspective. If you want a glimpse into that world, check out this video on screen right here, where I talk about what I learned growing up in the projects. And I'll see you in the next video.